I feel sorry for them.
They need our guidance, Odo, not our pity.
They cherish their freedom.
We'll have to break them of that.
So before we delve into this too intricately, I do want to address a few things. As you know, I've worked on several different projects involving a scenario where the Dominion battles the Borg. I even have an ongoing live-action project right now. In these various scenarios, there is one integral fact that I assumed, and I'm not going to be doing that here. In all of these scenarios, I presuppose the Dominion recognized the true threat that the Borg presented. In this essay, we'll take a more realistic look at how they might respond. What would happen with a Borg attack if the Dominion had won the Dominion War and now owned the Alpha and Beta quadrants? Let's just get into it. In 2374, the Starfleet Alliance launched an all-out attack to retake Deep Space Nine. Operation Return, as it was called, was successful and the Dominion was never able to receive reinforcements. But what if that didn't happen? What if Operation Return was a failure? This disappointment would have drastically changed the war. Cardassia is now reinforced, the Federation is all but annihilated, and they would ultimately probably offer a complete surrender. Though I believe Starfleet Admiralty would have purged a lot of their databanks before the surrender itself. The civilian and military leadership that had once been over the United Federation of Planets would be executed in grandiose fashion. The Klingon Empire would have fought to the last and been completely destroyed, possibly being reduced in size and population. It would have taken a few more years, but ultimately what Sisko said in the original timeline would have probably come true. The Romulans, finding themselves surrounded, would have had very hard choices to make. While they might try some subterfuge, I honestly could see them ultimately bowing down to the Dominion and becoming a member state with more privileges than the Federation and Klingons. After having won this hard fight, the Dominion would do what it's always done. It would restore order and slowly allow the various organizations to work as they please, as long as they towed the line. I do think that the Dominion would break up the Federation, and so they would return to individual governments such as the Vulcan High Command, United Earth, Andorian Empire, etc. Again, after a time, these governments would be able to run their own affairs, be forced to interact with each other, and get along. They would probably try to ensure that the Dominion really didn't notice them. Things would be relatively peaceful. I do know that many think Earth would be bombed into oblivion based on a line by Weyoun, but I just doubt that. I think the founders would have kept Earth as a monument to why you never go against them. Sort of a slave state. At this point, the stage is set. We have the Alpha and Beta quadrants with hundreds of different nation states that provide for the Dominion common good. The Dominion has been more than happy to just slowly expand in all directions and continues to have their order imposed upon people. While I think it would be interesting if the Dominion had started experimentations on humans or others to create an engineering class, I don't think they would have. I think they would have just kept the Jem'Hadar and the Vorta, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Let's address a couple of the concerns, the first one being, could the changelings be assimilated?
Section 31 must have created the virus, infected Odo, and then used him as a carrier.
So when he'd link with another changeling, he'd pass it on. Eventually, the entire race would be infected.
31 isn't just trying to stop us from finding a cure. They're trying to cover up the fact that they set out to commit genocide.
I honestly think that the answer to this is yes. This is because of one very simple reason, the morphogenic virus. This virus was able to impact their DNA or whatever they have and make everyone sick. If Section 31 can create a morphogenic virus that impacts their physiology, Borg nanoprobes would be able to find a way to adapt as well. It would only be a matter of time, and if they couldn't find a way to assimilate the founders, then they'd probably just have them killed off. So the changelings themselves wouldn't be as big an obstacle as some might think. The Vorta would be relatively easy, and I've discussed whether the Jem'Hadar would even be assimilated given their addiction, but with the medical technology the Borg had, it's quite possible that they'd be cured. Or they would just be utilized until the addiction to the white made them untenable. So whether they're assimilated or not, I think the issue would take care of itself. And there is another question. Do the Borg and Dominion know of each other? It's highly probable that both the Dominion and the Borg are aware of each other's existence. We can gather this for a few reasons.
With thousands of transwarp conduits with endpoints in all 4 quadrants. It allows the collective to deploy vessels almost anywhere in the galaxy within minutes.
First, we know that the Borg maintain exit apertures for their transwarp hubs in all of the quadrants. This includes the Gamma Quadrant. Additionally, the events of First Contact occur after the discovery of the wormhole and the Dominion. So even if we assumed that no First Contact had occurred between the Dominion and Borg, the Borg would be aware due to the assimilation of different Starfleet personnel. Also, it's highly likely that the Dominion would know due to subterfuge. Remember, they had people on Earth that was looking through their databases.
Captain Benjamin Sisko. I feel honored. Your psychographic profile is required reading for Vorta field supervisors. I probably know things about you you don't know yourself.
In fact, we know that Sisko is required reading by all Vorta supervisors. So one of the titular events that made him, the death of his wife to the Borg, would be a very, very big hole that the Dominion simply wouldn't miss. So it is likely that both the Dominion and the Borg are aware of each other. And then one would ask, how effective would Dominion weaponry be against the Borg? Well, it probably would be initially effective. We know that Dominion weaponry is powerful, but it's not Species 8472 powerful. It can be very punishing, but even Starfleet was able to adapt to it by the end of the year after initial contact. However, I don't think that the weapons would be the largest flaw in all of this. The Dominion would have the entire Alpha, Beta, and Gamma quadrants at its command, but in the end, it wouldn't be enough. Interestingly, the Borg and the Dominion for the most part share the exact same flaw: ego. The changelings don't care about the universe, they don't want to make things better, they want to keep everything under their control. So a disconnected, non-unified Alpha, Beta, and Gamma quadrant is the best result for them. The founders also had little care for the affairs of the solids as long as it didn't impact their day-to-day life. There would be Vorta overseers that most likely would look over all of these regions, kind of having their own fiefdoms, and all of them vying for the favor of their gods. So what exactly would happen? Most likely, it would be probably a small drip. The Borg would arrive with one cube, as they do, and assimilate various vessels or an outpost. One small blip like this would barely be heard by a caring Starfleet, so one can imagine how unenthused and uncaring Vorta would be. Whether the Vorta would respond or not really wouldn't matter because the Borg would again send their cube to Earth. This has, for a long time, been their standing objective. They would eventually encounter Jem'Hadar and the weaponry of the vessels, and the initial hits would be devastating, but since you have to effectively destroy an entire cube, they'd ultimately be lackluster in their attempts. We'd have something similar to Wolf 359, where vessels would just be tossed aside or assimilated. Even if they destroyed the cube by ramming into it, the next cube would probably be prepared for that. Now, while in the movie First Contact, we saw innovation of the Federation to fight the Borg, the Dominion would likely not continue to innovate their ships. Why should they? Additionally, we know that they are not on par with the magical engineers of the Federation, so the first cube would likely be successful in assimilating Earth or repopulating it, depending on if the Dominion had used biogenic weapons or not. The Borg would eventually create an Alpha Quadrant Unimatrix Zero for all intents and purposes. From here, they would slowly begin to push out. Initially, I feel like this would be considered like a border war and concern only the different Vorta squabbling between each other. Initially, this conflict would become an issue that the founders didn't take a lot of notice of. We know that the Dominion isn't against using biogenic weapons either, so they may attempt to try that or wholesale genocide. The problem is, the Borg are like a plague, or the wind. You can take out a sector, but they'll find ways to adapt and move on. It didn't matter even if a dozen planets were made desolate. They would just assimilate more. And every time they would assimilate more, they would find more Vorta and more Jem'Hadar, which would allow them to discover new locations. The Borg would likely spread like a virus, and the Dominion wouldn't be able to really cope with this. The collective would ultimately take both the Alpha and Beta quadrants and ultimately get to the Bajoran system. The Dominion would likely find a way to close the wormhole and then shut themselves in, leaving the Alpha and Beta quadrants to their fate. Dominion military assets would hold the line, and they would try to create a barrier and counter contingencies to fight against the Borg. And in the end, they'd still be unwilling or unable to negotiate with them. And at that point, we'll just end it with what Sisko would have to say on the matter.
So, instead of facing 3 separate opponents with 3 separate agendas, you'll find yourselves facing the same opponent on every side. There's a word for that. Surrounded.